She was 20 years old, a widow of 11 days, and she had exactly $31 to her name. Her husband, Thomas Bardell, had been dead less than 2 weeks, thrown from a wagon on the Millhaven Road when the axle snapped on a stone no bigger than a fist. And before the dirt on his grave had even settled, his father, Silas Bardell, stood in the doorway of the house she had called home and told her the land was his again. The cattle were his again. And she was, in his words, no longer anyone's concern but her own. She left with a carpetbag, a wedding ring she would not sell no matter how hungry she got, and those $31 folded into a handkerchief her mother had embroidered before she too had passed. With nowhere left to go, and no family who would have her, she walked into the dying town of Cooper's Bend, where the wind moved through empty buildings like it owned them, and she paid $11, nearly a third of everything she had, for the collapsed, forgotten shell of what had once been Ansel Cooper's trading post, a building so ruined that the man who sold it to her laughed as he pocketed her money, certain he had gotten the better end of a foolish girl's grief. She did not know, standing alone in that broken doorway with the sun going down behind her, that bricked into the wall behind the old counter, was a secret that Ansel Cooper had died protecting, one that would not only save her, but would return to an entire forgotten town everything it believed it had lost forever. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Eleanor Bardell. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten, the way Cooper's Bend felt forgotten, tell us in the comments. We would love to know where you are joining us from tonight. Eleanor had not always been a woman who understood hardship, though hardship, it seemed, had always understood her. She was born in 1863 in a modest farmhouse outside of Concordia, Kansas, the third of 5 children to a blacksmith named Walter Hale and his wife Agnes, a seamstress whose hands were never idle and whose voice, when she sang while she worked, was the sound Eleanor most associated with safety. It was from her mother that Eleanor learned patience with fine, exacting work, the kind of patience that does not rush a stitch even when the light is failing. And it was from her father that she learned the deeper lesson beneath his trade, that a thing broken was not a thing worthless, only a thing waiting for someone willing to look closely enough to see what it could still become. Walter Hale had a saying he repeated so often that his children rolled their eyes at it in private, though none of them ever forgot it. Rust, he would say, turning a ruined tool over in his big scarred hands before setting it in the forge, is not the end of the story. It's only where the story went quiet for a while. Eleanor absorbed this the way children absorb the truest things, without knowing she was absorbing anything at all, simply living inside a philosophy until it became her own. Her childhood was not soft, but it was full. She learned to read early and hungrily, borrowing books from a circuit preacher who came through twice a year and who noticed with some delight that the freckled Hale girl always had more questions than time allowed. She learned figures from her father, who insisted that a woman who could not do her own sums was a woman someone else would eventually cheat. And she learned, most of all, to notice which board in the porch was loose before someone twisted an ankle on it, to notice which customer left the shop looking troubled and might need a kind word more than a transaction, to notice the small, overlooked details that most people walked straight past. It was a skill without a name, but it would prove, in time, to be the very thing that saved her. By the time she was 17, Eleanor had become, without quite meaning to, the person her younger siblings and half the families on their road brought their broken things to. A cracked wheel spoke, a torn hem that needed more than mending, a family Bible whose spine had finally given out after 3 generations of hard use. She never charged for this. Her father used to say she had a habit of collecting other people's troubles the way some girls collected ribbons, And though he meant it as a gentle tease, Eleanor came to understand it as something closer to the truth. She simply could not walk past a thing that had been given up on without wondering, quietly, whether it deserved to be. She met Thomas Bardell at a barn dance in the spring of 1883, when she was 19 and already resigned, in the quiet way young women of her circumstances often were, to marrying practically rather than romantically. Thomas surprised her. He was the second son of a wealthy rancher, but he had none of the hardness his father Silas carried like a second skin. He laughed easily, worked harder than his position required, and looked at Eleanor the way her father had always looked at her mother, as though she were a puzzle he intended to spend a lifetime solving with tenderness rather than force. They married that autumn, against Silas Bardell's wishes, for Silas had wanted his son to marry into money or land, not into the daughter of a blacksmith with nothing to offer but her hands and her mind. Silas never warmed to her. He tolerated her, the way a man tolerates weather he cannot change. And Eleanor spent 3 years learning to live in a household where she was loved fiercely by one man and endured, at best, by everyone around him. Those 3 years were, despite Silas, the happiest of her life. Thomas taught her to ride properly, to read the sky before a storm, to understand cattle in the practical way a rancher's wife needed to. She, in turn, brought her father's philosophy into their small corner of the Bardell ranch, mending fences and tools and furniture that Silas would have simply discarded, saving the family more money in a single winter than anyone expected from the blacksmith's girl, as Silas still called her behind her back. Thomas used to tell her, in the quiet hour before sleep, that she saw value where his own father saw only waste, and that this, more than her face, more than anything, was what he had fallen in love with. It was a good marriage, an unremarkable and deeply happy one, and Eleanor believed, the way the young and fortunate always believe, that it would simply continue. It ended on a gray October morning in 1886, on the Millhaven Road, when a wheel axle that Silas had refused to have replaced, out of stinginess, though he would never admit it, gave way beneath Thomas's wagon at speed, and he was thrown against a stone wall that had stood on that stretch of road longer than the town itself. He died before Eleanor could reach him. She was 20 years old. Grief alone might have been survivable. What broke something deeper in her was what came after. Silas Bardell, who had never wanted her in the family, did not wait even the customary period of mourning before making his position clear. The ranch, the house, the herd, all of it had always technically belonged to him, held in trust for Thomas as the second son, and with Thomas gone, Silas saw no reason to continue supporting a daughter-in-law he had never chosen and did not intend to keep. He was not cruel in the way of raised voices or violence. He was cruel in the colder, more devastating way of a man who has already decided a person does not matter, and simply informs her of the fact as though reading a weather report. He gave her 3 days to gather her belongings. He offered her $20, which she refused to take, though hunger would make her regret that refusal more than once in the weeks to come. On the morning she left, he did not come out of the house to see her go. She had her carpet bag, her mother's handkerchief with $31 folded inside it, her wedding ring, and a small collection of books she could not bring herself to sell even when a peddler in Millhaven offered her a fair price for them. She had, in other words, almost nothing, and worse than nothing, she had no clear direction, no family to return to. Since her own parents had passed and her siblings were scattered and struggling in their own right, unable to take in another mouth to feed, she walked for 2 days, sleeping the first night in a church that left its doors unlocked, and the second in the loft of a stranger's barn with his grudging permission, until she came, on the 3rd day, to a town that the map still called Cooper's Bend, though nearly everyone who might have called it home had long since left it. Cooper's Bend had been, 20 years earlier, a modest but genuine trading crossroads, built up around a well-stocked post run by a man named Ansel Cooper, who by every account Eleanor would later gather had been well-loved and deeply trusted by the ranchers and homesteaders of the surrounding valley. But a drought in the late 1870s, followed by a rerouted stage line that bypassed the town entirely, had strangled Cooper's Bend slowly over a decade, until only a handful of stubborn or trapped families remained, scraping by in a settlement that the rest of the territory had quietly written off. Ansel Cooper himself had died some years back. The details were vague to Eleanor then, though they would not remain vague for long, and his trading post, once the beating heart of the town, stood collapsed and half swallowed by weeds at the center of what was left of Main Street, its roof caved in on one side, its sign hanging by a single rusted nail. It was this ruin that a man named Otis Rennick, who had somehow ended up holding the deed after Cooper's death through, means Eleanor did not yet understand, offered to sell her for $11, a price so low it should have told her something, though at the time she took it only as confirmation of how little the building was worth to anyone with sense. Rennick did not hide his amusement. "Ain't nothing in there but rotten rats, girl," he told her, counting her money into his palm with visible satisfaction. "But if you want to throw your money at a dead man's ruin, that's your business, and none of mine." Eleanor said nothing to that. She had learned, in her father's forge and in 3 years married to a man whose own father despised her, that it rarely paid to explain yourself to someone who had already decided who you were. She stood alone that evening in the collapsed doorway of the trading post, $31 now down to 20. No roof over half the building, no bed, no food beyond what remained in her carpetbag. And she allowed herself, for the length of exactly one long breath, to feel the full weight of how far she had fallen. A rancher's wife, 11 days a widow, standing in the ruin of a dead stranger's shop, with nothing left but her hands, her mind, and her father's old conviction that rust was never the end of the story. Then she straightened her spine, the way her mother had taught her to do before every hard task, and she stepped inside to see what, if anything, could still be saved. The first days were survival, plain and unglamorous. She cleared debris from one corner of the main room enough to sleep in, patched the worst of the roof gap with canvas she found in a collapsed stall out back, and began, out of habit more than plan, to catalog what remained of Ansel Cooper's inventory. Shelves of rusted tools, moth-eaten bolts of cloth, tins whose labels had faded past reading. It was on the 4th day, while she was prying loose a section of the long wooden counter that had partially collapsed against the back wall, that her hand caught on something the counter's fall had exposed. A section of brickwork behind where the counter had always stood, mismatched from the rest of the wall, mortared in a hand clearly less skilled than whoever had built the original structure. Her father's old instinct, the one that noticed loose boards before they became twisted ankles, rose in her at once. Bricked-in sections in old buildings, she knew from years of listening to her father talk about jobs he'd taken repairing homes and shops, almost never meant nothing. People bricked things in for one of two reasons: to hide something or to seal something away that frightened them. It took her the better part of 2 days, working carefully with a chisel and a mallet she'd found among Cooper's rusted tools, to loosen enough mortar to remove the first brick. What she found, once she'd cleared a space large enough to reach her arm through, was a small iron strongbox, so thick with dust and cobweb that it took her another full hour simply to work it free of the cavity without damaging whatever might be inside. The box was locked, but the lock was old, and the metal around it corroded enough that a firm strike with the flat of a hatchet sprang it open on the 3rd attempt. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had done its slow work of preservation for what she would later learn was nearly 9 years, she found a leather-bound ledger, a bundle of letters tied with faded twine, and, folded at the very bottom, a hand-drawn map of the valley surrounding Cooper's Bend, marked with small symbols she did not yet understand. That first night, by the light of a single tallow candle, Eleanor read enough of Ansel Cooper's ledger to understand that she had not stumbled onto treasure in the ordinary sense. No gold, no buried coin, but something that, in a town like Cooper's Bend, might prove far more valuable. The ledger was Cooper's careful, meticulous record of the water rights of the valley. Rights that had been legally and fairly established between the original homesteading families in the 1860s. Rights that Cooper himself had been the appointed trustee of since the town's small creek, the only reliable water source for a dozen struggling farms in dry years, ran directly behind his trading post. The letters, still more revealing, were correspondence between Cooper and a territorial land office, showing that in his final years, a man Eleanor did not yet recognize had been quietly attempting to have those water rights redrawn in his own favor. Exploiting the chaos of the town's decline and the deaths or departures of the original homesteading families to claim, on paper, control of the creek that fed what little life remained in Cooper's Bend. The name on those letters, appearing again and again as the party pressing the claim, was Ezra Colt. Eleanor read those letters 3 times through before she allowed herself to sleep that night. And even then, sleep came slowly, her mind turning over each careful phrase Cooper had written, each polite but immovable refusal he had sent back to the land office and to Colt's attorneys across nearly 4 years of correspondence. There was something in the old man's handwriting, a steadiness that did not waver even in his final letters, written, by the dates, only weeks before his death, that Eleanor recognized from her own father's hands at the forge, the particular calm of a man who has decided what is right and does not intend to be talked out of it by anyone, however powerful. She found herself, in the candlelight, speaking to Ansel Cooper as though he might somehow hear her, promising him in a whisper that whatever he had died protecting would not be wasted on a stranger who had simply gotten lucky prying loose the wrong brick. Eleanor did not yet know who Ezra Colt was, but she would learn soon enough, and the learning would not be gentle. As she spent the following weeks doing the double work of surviving, mending what she could of the trading post's structure, trading small repairs and sewing work to the handful of remaining families for food and materials, and quietly investigating what the ledger and letters meant, she pieced together a story that the town of Cooper's Bend had half forgotten and mostly stopped speaking of aloud. Ezra Colt was not a rancher or a homesteader. He was a land speculator and, more recently, the primary local agent for a railroad company, scouting new routes through the territory. And he had recognized, years before anyone else, that the water rights to Cooper's Bend's creek would become extraordinarily valuable the moment a rail spur was run through the valley. Valuable enough that whoever legally controlled that water could effectively control the price of every acre for 10 miles around. Ansel Cooper, as the trusted and neutral trustee of those rights, had stood in Colt's way. Refusing again and again to sign the transfer papers Colt kept producing, insisting the rights belonged to the town's founding families collectively, and not to any single claimant. Cooper had died of what the town vaguely called a fever, though Eleanor began to notice, the more she asked, how few people wanted to look at her directly when they said it, before Colt could force the matter. And in the town's subsequent decline, with families scattered and records lost or destroyed, Colt had simply continued quietly building his legal claim, waiting for the day no one remained who could contest it. That day, it seemed, had very nearly come. And now Eleanor Bardell, a penniless widow no one in the territory had ever heard of, living in the collapsed shell of a dead man's trading post, was the only person left holding proof of what the water truly belonged to, and to whom. The weight of that realization settled over her slowly, the way cold settles into a room after the fire has gone out. She was not a lawyer. She was not a landowner, not even truly a resident of Cooper's Bend in any way the territory would recognize, and she understood well enough, from watching how easily Silas Bardell had dismissed her the moment her husband was no longer alive to stand between them. How little a young widow's word counted against a man like Ezra Colt, who dressed well and spoke smoothly, and had, by every appearance, the full confidence of the railroad company behind him. And yet there was something in her, the same something that had made her pry at a mismatched brick instead of walking past it. The same something her father had planted in her without ever meaning to make a lesson of it, that refused to let the matter rest simply because it was difficult. She thought of Mrs. Ferris, widowed and alone, still tending a garden behind a house she could no longer afford to keep warm through winter. She thought of the Alvarez family's empty chair at their table, a son gone under circumstances no one wanted named aloud. If Ansel Cooper had been willing to die rather than hand a dying town's only water to a man who would ration it for profit, Eleanor decided, sitting alone by candlelight with his ledger open on her knees, then the very least she owed him, and owed herself, was the courage to finish what he had started. She did not act rashly. Her father's other great lesson, alongside his philosophy of rust, had been that a person who moves too quickly in an unfair fight generally loses it, and Eleanor spent the better part of a month doing quiet, careful work before she ever spoke Ezra Colt's name aloud to another living soul. She rebuilt enough of the trading post to reopen it in modest form, using the last of her money and the goodwill of families she'd helped with, repairs to restock a handful of essential goods. And in doing so, she gave herself both a plausible reason to remain in Cooper's Bend and a natural gathering point where she could, without suspicion, speak to the town's remaining residents and learn the fuller shape of what had happened. She learned that the Alvarez family, 3 farms up the creek, had lost their eldest son the same year Cooper died, in circumstances no one liked to discuss. She learned that the Petries, once among the wealthiest homesteaders in the valley, had quietly sold out and left within a year of Cooper's death, at a price that made no sense unless someone had frightened them into accepting it. She learned, most chillingly, from an old widow named Mrs. Ferris, who had known Ansel Cooper personally, that Cooper had told her, only weeks before his death, that he had put something aside where Colt would never think to look. Because a man like that never imagines anyone smarter than himself. It was around this time that Ezra Colt himself first appeared at Eleanor's reopened trading post, a tall, unhurried man in a well-tailored coat entirely too fine for a town as poor as Cooper's Bend, who introduced himself with the easy charm of someone accustomed to being believed. He had heard, he said, that the old Cooper place had a new owner, and he'd come to offer her a generous price for the building and land, generous enough, he implied, that a young widow with no other prospects would be foolish to refuse it. Eleanor, giving nothing away in her expression, thanked him politely and told him she would consider it, and it was only after he had gone, his boots unhurried on the boardwalk outside, that her hands began to shake with the effort of having stayed calm in front of the very man responsible, she now strongly suspected, for more sorrow in Cooper's Bend than the town itself yet understood. The conflict that followed was not one of guns or violence, though Colt's patience thinned considerably once Eleanor twice refused his offers, each one somehow more generous and more insistent than the last. He began, instead, the kind of quiet, respectable cruelty that Eleanor had already learned from Silas Bardell. that powerful men favored when they wished to destroy someone without dirtying their own hands. He spoke to the territorial bank that held the note on her small stock of goods and had her credit quietly called in early. He spread word, subtly enough that she could never quite trace it back to him directly, that the widow at the trading post was not quite right in the head, grieving and unstable, unfit to be trusted with the running of a business, let alone anything so serious as water rights. He made a formal filing with the Territorial Land Office, using the years of paperwork he had already built, to have the Cooper Bend water rights transferred to his name once and for all, citing the absence of any surviving trustee, a filing that, had it succeeded, would have rendered Ansel Cooper's ledger nothing more than a historical curiosity. There were nights that winter when Eleanor sat alone in the half-mended trading post, wind finding its way through gaps she had not yet managed to seal, and allowed herself to wonder whether she had simply traded one kind of powerlessness for another. Whether Silas Bardell's cold dismissal and Ezra Colt's polished cruelty were not, in the end, two faces of the very same coin, and whether a woman like her would ever be permitted to stand on ground that could not be taken from her by a man with more money and better connections. It would have been easy, in those moments, to accept one of Colt's increasingly generous offers. To take the money and disappear somewhere no one knew her name. To let the water rights and the ledger and all of it become someone else's problem. She thought seriously, more than once, about doing exactly that. But she kept returning, in her mind, to her father's forge, to the sight of him turning some ruined, rejected tool over in his hands, and refusing to see it the way the world had already decided to see it. And she found that she could not, in the end, do to Ansel Cooper's memory what Silas Bardell had done to her. Declare something finished, simply because it was inconvenient to continue believing in it. Eleanor's response was not to fight Colt on his terms, which she knew, as a woman alone with no legal standing and no money for lawyers, she could never win outright. Instead, she did what her mother had taught her with a needle, and her father had taught her with a broken tool. She worked patiently, with everything she had, on the one thing that was genuinely hers to control. She spent 3 weeks traveling, on foot and by borrowed horse, to every remaining member of the Valley's founding families she could locate. The Alvarez family, the Petrie's surviving cousin, 2 elderly brothers named Whitcomb, who had nearly given up their claim entirely, and to each of them she showed Ansel Cooper's ledger and letters, explaining plainly what Colt had been attempting and what it would mean for all of them if he succeeded. She asked nothing of them except their word, given freely and recorded in writing, that they remembered and recognized the original water rights agreement Cooper had protected. One by one, moved as much by the sight of Cooper's careful handwriting as by Eleanor's own quiet, unshakable conviction, they gave it. Armed with the ledger, the letters, the map, and now the sworn statements of every surviving original claimant in the Valley, Eleanor made the long journey to the Territorial Land Office herself, traveling 3 days with a widow's meager funds and a determination that had nothing left to lose. She was not, at first, taken seriously. The land office was a long room of tired clerks and taller men in finer coats, and more than one official glanced at her travel-worn dress and her carpet bag of papers, with the particular blend of pity and dismissal she had come to recognize since Thomas's death. As though a widow's grief entitled others to assume she had also lost her competence along with her husband, she was made to wait 3 days simply to be seen, and when she finally was, the first clerk who reviewed her papers suggested, not unkindly, that she might be better served finding a husband to manage such complicated affairs on her behalf. Eleanor did not argue with him. She only asked, evenly, whether he might find her a clerk who dealt in law rather than in advice, and it was this quiet persistence, the same patient refusal to be waved away that had once unsettled Silas Bardell, that eventually brought her papers to the desk of a careful man who recognized, in Cooper's original trusteeship paperwork, a legal claim that Colt's years of maneuvering had never actually managed to overturn, only obscure. The water rights, the clerk ruled after several tense weeks of correspondence, remained legally vested in the collective trusteeship Cooper had established, now formally recognized as passing, in the absence of any other surviving trustee willing to serve, to Eleanor Bardell herself, who had recovered and presented the original documentation. Ezra Colt's quiet campaign collapsed as quietly as it had been built. Without the water rights to leverage, his railroad company found a more cooperative route through a neighboring valley. And Colt himself, his reputation for respectable ruthlessness, now quietly whispered about among the territorial land offices who had seen Eleanor's evidence, found his influence in that corner of the territory considerably diminished. He left Cooper's Bend within the year and was not seen there again. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public unmasking. Only the slow, satisfying justice of a man's careful scheme unraveling under the weight of the truth he had assumed no one would ever find. Undone in the end, not by force, but by the patient attention of a woman he had dismissed as foolish and unstable the very first time they met. What Eleanor did with the water rights once they were secured was, to the families of Cooper's Bend, more remarkable than the recovery itself. She did not sell them, though she could have, for a sum that would have made her wealthier than she had ever been, even as Thomas Bardell's wife. Instead, she formally re-established Cooper's original trusteeship arrangement, ensuring the creek's water remained equally and permanently accessible to every homesteading family in the valley, exactly as Ansel Cooper had always intended it. She used what little profit her rebuilt trading post generated, along with a small stipend the reformed trusteeship allowed her as its administrator, to help repair the town's other neglected buildings, and within 2 years, Cooper's Bend, the town everyone had written off, the town Silas Bardell would have said was fit for nothing but foolish girls throwing their money away, began, slowly and stubbornly, to come back to life. Families who had left began to hear of it and return. New families, drawn by fair water and an honest trading post, began to arrive. The Alvarez family repaired their fence line for the first time in 3 years. Mrs. Ferris, who had once told Eleanor she expected to die alone in a cold house, found herself instead surrounded most evenings by neighbors' children who gathered on her porch to hear her stories of the town's better days, now that better days no longer felt like something confined to the past. The schoolhouse, shuttered since before Eleanor's arrival, reopened with 11 students on its first morning, a number that seemed impossibly large to a town that had, not 2 years before, seemed destined to vanish from the territorial maps altogether. The sign above her door, which she had restored herself, letter by careful letter, no longer read Cooper's Trading Post, but simply the Trading Post, Est, by A. Cooper, restored by E. Bardell, a small line she had added at the bottom in her own steady hand, not out of pride, but because she believed, the way her father had taught her to believe, that the story of a thing should not erase the people who had cared for it along the way. She was 20 years old when she arrived in Cooper's Bend with $31, a widow cast out by a man who saw no value in her, standing in the ruin of a building everyone believed was worthless. What she carried with her, though no one could have counted it the way they counted her money, was a lifetime of learning to notice what other people walked past. A loose board, a rusted tool, a mismatched section of brick behind an old counter, and the quiet, unshakable conviction that a thing gone silent was never the same as a thing gone forever. Ansel Cooper had believed in his final years that he was protecting a valley's water from a man who wanted to steal it. He could not have known that the person who would finish what he started, who would carry his careful trusteeship forward and give an entire dying town back its future, would be a stranger not yet born to the family that would one day cast her aside. A widowed girl with nothing but her hands, her mind, and her father's old certainty that rust is never the end of the story. Only the place where the story goes quiet for a while, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Eleanor's story tonight. If it moved you, we would be so grateful if you shared it with someone who might need a reminder that overlooked things and overlooked people often hold more value than the world is willing to see at first glance. We would love to know, in the comments below, has there ever been a time in your own life when you found real value in something or someone that everyone else had already written off? We read every one of them, and they mean more to us than you know. Until next time, stay close.